Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome everyone to the Project Ihya Podcast. I would like to start by first introducing our esteemed guest, Mufti Zain Beg. Mufti Zain Beg was born and raised in Montreal, Quebec, Canada. He formally began his higher religious studies in Al Madani Masjid under the tutelage of Maulana Imran Sharif after having completed the memorization of the Quran. After studying the Alim course for 4 years with a number of local scholars, or scholars local to Montreal, Mufti Zain completed his studies with honors in Darul Uloom, Canada in 2019. Thereafter, Mufti Zain pursued specialization in Ifta in Darul Uloom Mahmudiyya, South Africa, under the world-renowned Mufti Ibrahim Desai rahimahullah. Mufti Zain Bey is currently a teacher in Darul Uloom Montreal and serves as a Mufti for the Canadian Centre of Islamic Research and Ifta, CCIRI. He holds a bachelor's degree in education, and is a certified Quebec teacher. He's also certified Sharia advisor and auditor under the AAOIFI. He is a Sharia consultant for Sharia Review Bureau based in Bahrain and advises on Sharia matters to multiple companies in Canada, such as Manazil, Iqraz, and more. He's also on the Sharia board of Stearns Bank, USA. Mufti Beg, welcome to Project Ihya Podcast.
Jazakumullah khairan.
And after that introduction, inshallah, we're going to move into today. We're going to be talking around the topic of Madhahib. And inshallah, I want to hand it over to Hafiz Mus'ab, inshallah, to say a few words and inshallah begin the questions. Jazakumullah.
Jazakumullah khairan, Mawlana Asudullah, for the introduction and of our guest. And I would also like to extend a warm welcome. And as Mawlana Asudullah mentioned, the topic today will be on Madhahib. What are Madhahib and why are they needed? And my goal is going to be to ask difficult questions, questions that people may have in mind. And I'll be posing them to Mufti Zain as well as our other co-hosts, inshallah. So let's go ahead and start with the most obvious question. What is a madhab?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Wassalatu wassalamu ala ashrafil anbiya'i wal mursaleen wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. So, in essence, when we go back and we look at how Muslims have been practicing Deen, of course, as believers, our main two sources of reference or places of reference is the Book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the Sunnah of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Of course, it was a lot easier to do that when Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam was still alive, because we could directly ask Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam about our matters, and he would basically tell us exactly what we needed to do. Then after Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam passed away, after the demise of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, those who were near to Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, the Sahaba radiyallahu ta'ala anhum, they took on the responsibility to educate the generations afterwards. However, all of the Sahaba radiyallahu anhum were not involved in the same things, right? So Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, of course, was a markaz himself, right? He was a person who was a jami', a person who was involved in all sorts of things, right? He took care of administrative affairs, he took care of jihad, he took care of answering the queries of the people, he took care of tazkiyah. So the Sahaba radiyallahu ta'ala anhum all essentially right, divided themselves according to whatever they had taken most from Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So some certain Sahaba radiyallahu anhum became more prominent than others in terms of answering fiqh and fatawa and all those and what have you, and the like of those things. So then, of course, as time passed and as Islam started to spread over different lands, and you didn't really have a centralization of Deen anymore, right? There was this need, and again, obviously, I'm just oversimplifying, about a century of development, and this is where you started to have a codification of fiqh. You start to have a codification of the different acts of worship, or you could say different things which are obligatory upon a believer. And that's why when we look at, for example, the definition of fiqh, right? So madahib are, of course, it's a general, right? It's a general word. It's a word, right? Essentially, like like madhab is ism dharf, which refers to the place of going, right? So where a person essentially goes to guide themselves for the matters of deen, right? But generally, when we think of when we hear the word madhab, or what madhab are you on, then we think of fiqh, right? So in that context, when we look at the definition of fiqh early on, then it was very general, right? It referred to, right, Imam Hanifa rahmatullah alayhi, defined it as whatever a nafs has to do, and whatever is, nafs has to stay away from, whatever person has to stay away. So, but then as we moved along in time, then further codification took place, and further classifications took place. So in a nutshell, right, you had two big markas, you could say, in Islam, in the early Islam. You had Iraq, and then you had Medina, where Sahaba radiallahu anhum had settled. And all the madahib that we have, essentially, right, they spring from these two places, essentially from taking directly from the Sahaba of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So these fuqaha, right, these fuqaha who lived in these areas, and there was a lot of fuqaha, right, not only the four that we know today. There were many of them, but it just so happened that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had made it such that certain individuals, they laid their mark, and the people who came after them essentially, devoted themselves and dedicated themselves to develop this madhab. So if we look at, for example, Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullah alayhi, Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullah alayhi, what's famously known is that he had a council of ulama who were around him. And notably from his students, you had Imam Muhammad, Imam Abu Yusuf, Imam Ghufar, and many others. So what's very interesting is that although these imams are in and of themselves, they are mujtahidun. It means that they have the capability of independent reasoning. They can look at the nusus, and they can derive the rulings. However, Imam Muhammad rahmatullah alayhi, instead of going his own direction, and instead of developing his own type of school, he focused himself in documenting the works of his teacher Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullah alayhi. So basically, right now we have these four madahib, the four schools which have been developed over time, and where we essentially go to the system to essentially guide ourselves in our affairs.
So, Jazakumullah khairan for the answer. One thing I want to do for this discussion, I want it to be like a guide for a new Muslim, right? A new Muslim who's just, for example, he just became Muslim, and someone told him, okay, you need to know you need to follow a madhab. So he may not even know, what is fiqh. He may not understand these things. What gives rise, from the text? What are nusus? Who are fuqaha? What gives rise to these kinds of differences? Why are differences existing? So you mentioned, for example, from what you just mentioned, what is a madhab? You mentioned like a madhab is a way, right? So a madhab is a path. So why do they exist? Like you mentioned, there are differences in the nusus. Can you give can you shed some light on specifically what causes these differences to rise, basically?
So basically, right, we have at the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam certain things which Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he made clear, and Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he did so right, for obvious reasons, and whatever, what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had intended, and there are certain things with Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam mentioned for a person to follow, and of course the Sahaba radiallahu, and it's possible that in a later action of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam may have changed based on different circumstances. So now there are some Sahaba radiallahu anhum who only witness one action, and they go back to their tribes, and they spread this action. But it's possible that a later Sahabi who came later on, he witnesses something else, and he goes on to spread that. So again, because there's no clear guidance, right, from Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam that this is my actual action, or this is from now on, this everything else is abrogated, then this is where there's that flexibility which comes about, right? And this actually happened at the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. A famous incident, which I don't recall the exact ghazwa, if Mufti Zain remembers. So there's a ghazwa which Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that all of you should pray your asr. You should pray your asr in that location. So
غزوة بني قريظة.
Bani Qurayza, right? So all of you should pray your asr in Bani Qurayza. So you had one group of Sahaba radiallahu ta'ala anhum who understood this command of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam to mean that they need to hasten. They need to hasten towards Banu Qurayza, but it doesn't mean that they can't pray along the way or that they can't pray before going. So they prayed their asr, and then there was another group of Sahaba radiallahu anhum who understood this command. And Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam mentioned that we need to pray asr only there. So Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam didn't mention that any of them were wrong. So this is essentially something which is a beauty of our deen, essentially, right? Something which deen has given us flexibility on certain matters based on the different nusus that we have, and every single person, right? And this is something which is extremely important, that every madhab, whatever they may be disagreeing upon, every madhab is trying to reach the truth. Everyone is trying to understand what was actually, right, the hukam. What would be if Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would be alive today, and Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would show us how to pray. How would Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam pray? Every single madhab, right, whether it be the Shafi'i madhab, the Hanafi madhab, the Maliki madhab, or the Hanbali madhab, or any other faqih, is essentially trying to tell the awam that these are the expectations that you have from Allah and Rasul, and this is how we've understood that these are the expectations that you have.
I think another point also about like why madhab is actually just the nature of language. Anything that Allah and His Rasul have said, obviously when we process it, we're interpreting it. Every single person is interpreting it. So whether a person follows a madhab or quote unquote doesn't follow a madhab, in either cases what they're doing is they're still accessing the text through some kind of interpretation, right? Whether it's their own interpretation or some sheikh from the last century or some sheikh from a couple of centuries ago. I suppose the only difference with the Madhaahib would be that the founders of the four Madhaahib are pretty early on, closer to the time of the Prophet ﷺ and the Sahaba radiallahu anhum, and they're also at the end of the day following the Quran and Sunnah. It's just a question about how does one understand it, how does one interpret it. So I think basically when we talk about madhab, I think there might be a fallacy that we're following something, like something specific. Some people will even portray it as like, no, instead of following the madhab, you should follow Quran and Hadith. But everyone is following Quran and Hadith. The only difference is that obviously how do you understand it and what do you use as a process to understand it. What the madhahib do, which is basically what every single human being is doing, consciously or subconsciously, is that they give you a methodology to process it. That if you have this kind of text, then what do you do? How do you authenticate, chains of narrations and so on and so forth? So it gives you an entire methodology. But everyone has that methodology. Like whether somebody says they have one or they don't have one, everybody has that methodology. So I think adding to the valuable comments that Mufti Zain made, it's also something natural, basically, that ends up happening with any kind of text. There's always some kind of interpretive, methodology that's used.
So both of them, both muftis, Mufti Tufayl and Mufti Zain, mashallah, they touched on important aspects of it. Aside from the linguistic aspect of it, I think maybe some people will understand it more easier from the fact that a madhab is basically how somebody interacts with the nusus. Mufti Zain, he mentioned in the beginning that the sources of Sharia are Quran and Sunnah. Primarily, there's qiyas and there's ijma' as well. But now, how does one interact with those nusus? Now, different people are going to interact with those sources, and everybody's going to apply their mind and no two minds are entirely alike. And that's why you find differences how they interpret. The common factor, what is accepted, is the Quran, the Sunnah, the Ijma. But then how they interact with it, there's going to be some variation, and that variation is what brings about the differences in the madhahib. Now, that's not to say that they've added something from their own side. The madhab itself is a path that a certain scholar took, but it doesn't mean that he's going against the nusus. It means that he's interpreting the nusus. That's something that's solid and established. But the interpretation, now that's going to vary. But then again, when it comes to the world of interpretation, who gets to interpret or whose interpretation holds weight? And as Mufti Tufail mentioned, that now we have these schools of interpretation, which have a complete methodology and they're systemized, and it's a complete structure, and it's well thought through, and it's well developed, and that's something. And also on top of that, the ummah has also made ijma on these schools of thought. They're accepted by large groups, if not all of the ummah over the last so many centuries. So they're accepted as well, and that's kind of why it becomes necessary. So as Mufti Tufail mentioned, that when you're going to approach Quran and Sunnah, the basic nusus, you're also going to approach it. You're also going to interpret it. Don't think that you're going to be following the Quran and Sunnah without some level of interpretation. The only difference is that somebody who doesn't follow a madhab is following his own interpretation, whereas somebody who is following a madhab will be following an interpretation of the authorities of Quran and Sunnah.
So what I'm hearing is that basically the madahib arise because of texts that can have different meanings. Nusus meaning text, right? And so that interpretive layer, wherever somebody puts thought to something, then that means that will be a madhab, right? So if basically, why should we restrict ourselves to those four madahib? Were there no other madahib? And at that time, and at the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, there were these four madahib did not exist, right? And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam did not say to follow the madahib. The Sahaba did not say to follow the four madahib because they didn't even exist that time. So what makes it so important to follow these four madahib?
So there's a lot to unpack in that question. So I want to actually take you back to one of the questions that one of the scenarios you kind of mentioned right before I answered the previous one, which was if somebody goes to a non-Muslim and says you have to follow a madhab, right? So first, what does it mean to you have to, right? So even like whoever is a pro madhab, right? Is a pro madhab, they all believe we have to follow a madhab. Right? But what do we mean by follow that we have to follow a madhab? So this is Mufti Uthmani and another great ulama have written very extensively on this topic, and I've mentioned it very beautifully that when we say that it's wajib for a person to follow a madhab, we're not saying wajib like in equating it to the wajib that we find in the books of fiqh, right? So the same way like witr is wajib, right? And a person who doesn't pray witr, right, he's sinful. We're not saying wajib in terms of the shari'i definition of wajib, but rather we're saying wajib intidaman, so wajib in a way, in an administrative way. It's obligatory for a layman to follow madhab so that they are able to organize their deen, right? Especially because of the fact that we are obligated by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to follow deen and sharia, and we are also obligated by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to follow deen in a way where we're not allowing our nafs or not allowing our desires to come in between our worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the reality of the matter is that when a person doesn't have a guide, doesn't have in anything of that matter, if a person doesn't have a direction, a person doesn't have a system, right? Then they are not able to really stage to reach their destination in a right way. So now a person today feels he feels a bit off. And you know what, he's he throws up, so he takes the opinion from one of the madhabs that that doesn't break the wudu when they throw up. And then the next day he takes an opinion from somebody else that he can, that his wudu doesn't break if he touches his spouse. And the next day he takes another opinion that his wudu doesn't break when there's blood that comes out. So now he's no longer right. The line between him following deen and him doing it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala without his nafs coming in between, right? Those lines start becoming blurry now, right? And
So
now,
why should it matter? Like, if all of these opinions are correct and there's flexibility in deen, then why does it matter if he switches every day? Because this is all a range of correct opinions, right?
right. So no one's going to police anybody, right? No one's going to police anybody that you have to do this, you don't have to do this. So what we're essentially saying is that if the line between a person following deen and not following their nafs and not following their desires is a very thin line, right? And a person won't be able to really understand and realize whether his actions are guided by real necessity or by just following what his desires tell him to do.
I
So
think
what
also, like, we can go one step further and ask this question, that like if somebody is looking at a range of different opinions, as Mufti Zain mentioned, that it's based on desires, right? So if you ask a person this question, that you have these 4 or 5 opinions in front of you, on what basis are you actually giving preponderance to one, giving preference to one over the other? If the person says, oh, because I like it better, right? Was that because of evidence? Was that because of and that's where I think the trick plays out. Especially if a person who is not acquainted with the proofs and the evidences that are behind it, and a person who's truly acquainted with that will realize the gravity of just looking at various opinions and picking one that they like. But generally, if a person is doing that, then deep down, basically, it's based on what they want to do. It's just based on what they feel like is easier, right?
So if we take it one step back, like, let's say there are 5 opinions, like you mentioned, right? Would all these 5 opinions, are they all correct or not? Because if they're all correct, then why does it matter on what basis he's choosing one or the other? Because they're all just correct. Like, it's like he's choosing to eat goat meat or cow meat, right? But if they are mutually exclusive, right? If they cannot be correct at the same time, wouldn't this question only come into play then?
Could I just address something that was in the first question? You made a statement that they didn't exist at the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We have to keep in mind that Madhahib is sort of an outgrowth of something else. What is that something else? It's an outgrowth of the hukm of the Quran, right? That أطيعوا الله وأطيعوا الرسول وأولي الأمر منكم, or for example, لعلمه الذين يستنبطونه منهم, or for example, there's other ayat indicating that you listen to authority. So madahib is just hearkening back to the idea of taking from an authority. At the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he was the authority, so it didn't necessarily need any other authority. At the time of Sahaba ridwanullahi alayhim ajma'in, people would go back to the Sahaba, and even some Sahaba would go back to other Sahaba, as Mufti Zain mentioned in the beginning. They would go to the authorities in fiqh. And then, and in those days, there wasn't a fear that people would follow. They would have this, array of opinions in front of them, and then they would be choosing. This fear didn't exist simply because of the dynamics of the era. People were kind of in their own little village or town or a city, and they would go to the authority of that town or village. So they were doing taqleed essentially of that scholar. Then the time after that came where this fiqh of those scholars started to tadween took place, meaning they were now recorded, they were written down. So a person could essentially sit in his village, he would have the local scholar there, and he had a myriad of opinions in front of him as well written down. So now this issue comes up. Now, can I just pick and choose opinions here, or should I continue just following the authority of my town? So that's when actually the problem arose, and when the problem arose, then the solution was needed. It wasn't that the solution that problem didn't exist at the time of Rasulullah. They were just referred to him. And at the time of the early Sahaba and even the Tabi'un, the tadween of fiqh hadn't necessarily happened in the form of fiqh. Yeah, ahadith were being written and things like that. People for rulings would just go to their local authority. But once tadween happened, so that opened the doors for now people to pick and choose. And when the option now sits where people can pick and choose, then what happens to the integrity of the deen that they were following? Because now they can just follow whatever they want to follow by saying that this is the opinion of so and so other scholar. And then that becomes a issue of people just choosing whatever they want to choose, and even falling into the problem of taking the shudud of different ulama. And I think there's an ijma, even from the earliest of the scholars, that they would say that if a person just sits there and takes from the shudud of all of the ulama, they become the biggest fasik. So instead of actually following deen, you actually end up, ironically, you
What are shuzud?
Oh, sorry, shudud is just like a
Scarce opinions, rare opinions, like the
yeah,
opinions
like
are
a rare opinion, like a very far unique, something that's very away from the I'm trying to get the right
majority of what's majority agreed upon.
yeah, it's like a rare opinion, far away opinion. And usually a lot of scholars, they would have on certain issue, they would have a very strange opinion. Now some people, they'll come around and they'll say, well, listen, I'll take that strange opinion from him and that strange opinion from him and that one from him. So what they're doing is really just following whatever their heart tells them. And now the issue becomes a person could be the biggest fasiq, he's compiled all of these errant, kind of like an errant opinion, you can say. And he thinks I'm following deen, and he's given a shape to deen that looks nothing like the original deen.
Yeah, so Mufti Zain, I'm really interested to hear your answer. Like, if there are basically these valid opinions, these 5 valid opinions, we would say that they're all correct. So then what prevents a person from why should it not be on the basis of whatever? Like, what does it matter what basis?
So I think one thing which is first important to unpack as well is this whole concept of all these opinions are correct, right? Like, to my knowledge, right, that's not something any scholars has ever written, right? And to the contrary, right, what's written in the books of fiqh is that when an imam forms an opinion on something, the attitude that they have towards this opinion, right, is that it is sawab wa yahtamil al-khata, and that it is correct, and it has the it has a possibility of possibly being incorrect. But when we look at the madahib, the other madahib, right, the way we look at it is we say khata'un wa yahtamilu as-sawab, that is an error, that I believe that this is an error, but it also has the possibility of being true. So when we're looking at it in all practical purposes, right, there can only be one correct answer, right? And that's the answer which I'm going to choose. I can't act on something which is incorrect.
Isn't that something tricky though? Like, you're kind of giving some ijtihadi powers to a layperson, right? Because you're saying that for the layperson, they're saying that هذا صواب ويحتمل الخطأ and وهذا خطأ يحتمل الصواب. Then do you want to just explain, like, isn't that kind of giving some level of authority of ijtihad to a layperson?
So this is actually where we're saying that the layperson doesn't have the, like, when they're going to choose, right? So if we're going to say that all these opinions, like, so I would say that all of these opinions, however we've gotten to those opinions, the methodology that has been used is something which is correct, and it's based on a sound methodology. So the manner of getting to that opinion is correct. So we can conclude that inshallah that mujtahid, right, has formulated a correct opinion based on his methodology. But now the question is that when we have these 4 or 5 opinions, how is, right, a person going to choose what methodology, right, was the right methodology to come to that? Because for all practical purposes, your action is one, so there can only be one correct answer, right? So like I give a couple of examples for wudu. Now, does wudu break does wudu break if I bleed? Right? We can't say that, oh yeah, it's correct to say that in my practical example that it'll be correct for me to make wudu, it'll be correct for me not to make wudu, because they're two complete opposite results. So now how am I going to discern between okay, all these opinions and say this is the correct one and that's not the correct one, when I don't have the capability of actually understanding all of the reasonings and understanding all of the methodologies and then choosing which methodology I'm going to choose. So that's why, right, we choose one methodology that we trust and we say that this is what I'm going to follow, so that I'm not put into a situation where I'm just arbitrarily picking, between methodologies.
What if somebody brings the objection that um, despite two things being contradictory, you could still have ta'addud al-sawab, like you could still have multiple things that are correct, even though they're contradictory. For example, in the hadith that you mentioned, they both did two different things, and there could have only been one correct thing, right? But the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he chose to be silent, and he endorsed both of them. And like if somebody says that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "Ikhtilafu ummati rahma," right? The ikhtilaf of my ummah is rahma. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created this situation where something is dhanni, something is speculative. And so even though they're contradictory, Allah kept room for both of them. And that's why both of them are, correct. What would you say to that?
So now that's so that example that you mentioned about the Sahaba radiallahu anhum making ijtihad, that goes back to the mujtahidun. That the Sahaba, that the mujtahidun who understand the kalam of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam holistically, right? So for example, Imam Ahmad rahmatullah alayhi, when he was asked about a mujtahid, right? And he was asked, is a person a mujtahid if he knows this many hadith? And he said no, and he said no until he got to 400,000. He said, okay, now this person, is a mujtahid.
He said maybe, actually.
He said maybe, right? Exactly. He said maybe he's a mujtahid. So now, right? So they have a holistic understanding of the kalam of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. They have a holistic understanding of the lugha, right? So I'm not just talking about
what does lugha mean? Sorry.
Language, right? So I'm not just talking about a person who masters the last 20 pages of Tafsir al-Nahu and knows all of his huruf. I'm talking about somebody who knows poetry and has his lugha mastered. So they, right now, they are going to apply their reasoning based on all of that, and inshallah, where they reach, right, they're all going to get reward for it. So and why that ties into the Sahaba, because the Sahaba were making ijtihad of the kalam of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? We can't use that analogy for the layman who's making ijtihad of the aqwal of the sayings of ulama who came centuries after him. So the ijtihad that he's doing and this type of deciphering that he's doing has no comparison to what the Sahaba radiallahu anhum did.
Yeah, actually that reminds me of this conversation that took place between Sheikh Saeed Ramadan al-Bouti and Sheikh Nasruddin al-Albani about a person who just accepts Islam and is like a teenager, and basically, should he follow, if he hears that the four Madhahib agree on something and he has access to hadith and he sees that the hadith says something, should he follow the hadith or should he follow what the four Madhahib say? Someone can say that you've really complicated this. You're saying, oh, there's methodology, there's like Arabic, you have to learn poetry. That's a very complex process. The deen was made to be very easy. The deen was supposed to be accessible, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made the Quran, and it's bayyin, and it's mubin, and it's clear, and the hadith also is clear. So can someone say that, oh, this is just a very complex process that it's turned out to be, it's not actually simple anymore?
So what was Sheikh Ramadan's answer?
No, I'm asking you. I'm asking you.
Okay, I thought you were recalling a conversation.
Yeah, I was recounting the converation, but then that led to a question in my mind.
So now the thing is, right, is first we have to ask ourselves, right, is it actually complex? Number one, and number two, are these matters supposed to be easy, right? So if we agree, number one, that they're complex, okay, then why are they complex? And number two, the second question is, was this matter supposed to be easy? And the answer to that question is, we've made it difficult based on our emotions, right? So at the end, what happens is that we can't tolerate that that another person is doing something different, and this is, not to mention specific groups, but you have people who like, they see you praying differently next to you, and then they're just so bothered, their whole salah they're bothered, that they have to come to you and they have to say, brother, do you know that Imam Bukhari wrote this, and why aren't you raising your hands, and why aren't you joining your feet towards me? So like, we've made it complex, right? The ummah
I
has
think
been
that's a really good point, actually. Like, I've never thought of it from this angle, but I think that's actually a really genial way to look at it. That it's very relative, right? Like, somebody can say complex, but complex for who? For a surgeon, surgery is not, as complex as it is for a layperson, right? So yeah, for sure, if it's a faqih, then for him this is not a complex matter. But for a person that is not acquainted with the deen, with the comprehensive, the corpus of hadith, with the Quran and its interpretation and the lugha related to it, that might seem complex. But I really like that answer.
Right, and I think it's actually less complex to go directly to the madhab, right? And like, Asad or Mustafa, you would probably agree with me that, sometimes when we're like, you're studying, say, Muslim, I would say, when there's all these riwayat, and you get overwhelmed, and you look at all these different riwayat, and they have different implications, riwayat narrations. And then, you should actually say alhamdulillah that, I have I follow madhab, and I don't have to do all this complex reasoning and understanding, because this all has already been done for me over the centuries. So it's actually less complicated to go directly towards a madhab.
Let me ask an interesting question here. We know how a layperson, if he wants to get a ruling on something within a madhab, right? He'll just go to a mufti of that madhab and he'll get an answer. What would it look like for a person who does not want to use the madahib? Like, if he truly does not want to follow anyone and he wants to get a ruling, what would he have to go through?
So if you don't mind, let me hitch a similar question with Musab's, and I think it ties in really well. But what would you say that, if a person goes to a mufti for a madhab, or for an opinion for his answer, how much is he really following a madhab, right? So in this kind of like era that we live in today, where a person goes to their local mufti or their local imam and they're asking questions, they're not very acquainted with the books of the madahib or the methodology, or who are the imam of the madhab. So is there truly a sense of following a madhab or not?
So that's a bit of a difficult question, because of course, like the layman, he's obligated to ask somebody, right? So he's obligated to ask somebody for his whatever his daily masail are. So in terms of what he's obligated to do, once he's asked that imam of the masjid, what should I do in this situation, his job is done. But like, following one angle of following a madhab is that, like it's talab al-ilmi farida ala kulli Muslim, that it's fard on every Muslim to make talab al-ilm. And I like to say this, and Mufti Tafil, maybe you can chime in on this, that I don't feel like answering a question is actually making talab al-ilm, right? Talab al-ilm is for a person to figure out what he's supposed to do in that situation before it occurs. So he's supposed to know, right, the ahkam of Sawm, ahkam of Hajj, ahkam of Zakat, before he engages in those actions, right? And now if he needs further clarifications, he goes and he seeks an answer from somebody there. But talabul ilm, right, that's something which is fard on every single person. So what should a person make talabul ilm on? You should do talabul ilm in one certain madhab, so that he can have his deen regimented in one direction. Now when it comes to asking an imam, right, like his now the imam is essentially bound to give an answer, and to stay in it, and essentially stay in his lane, right? If he's not able, like for example, a lot of people come to me, and we're in a community in Montreal where we have people from all sorts of madhabs, and someone will specifically say, can you give me an opinion based on the Maliki madhab? Well, I'm not trained in the Maliki madhab, right? I don't have iftar training in the Maliki madhab, so I'm not going to now give you a Hanafi opinion when you want a Maliki opinion. So this is, I think that's a bit I think that's a different. I think the two different things. So what does the layman have to do on his regular, on his, in terms of his following, and then the second is that like what does the imam who was answering the question, what boundaries does he need to stay within when he's answering the
So
question?
I think
what is the
this
answer?
sorry, I think this kind of highlights a thing that people don't often think about, and that is that you can't escape following a madhab. Whether if you go to any imam, right? Even if he doesn't follow a madhab, when you take his opinion, you're following his madhab.
I mean, that's what I was saying earlier, right? That it's basically, it's not, when you say it's wajib for a person to follow a madhab, I understand it as like logically necessary, that it will happen. You can deny it. It's like a person who's driving a car, but they're saying like, I'm definitely not driving a car. This thing just has a steering wheel, and it so happens that it also has wheels and an engine, and it's taking me somewhere, but I'm not driving a car. That's basically what's happening. The person is saying, I'm
I mean,
not following a madhab, but doing everything that, following a madhab entails.
Yeah, I mean,
Maybe not.
often people will come and say like, "What's the answer to this question?" And you give them the answer, and they'll say, "You're wrong because the hadith says this," and then you ask them, "Okay, where did you read this hadith?" They'll say, "No, so and so imam told me." So I mean, okay, that imam told you this hadith. I would probably give you an answer to this hadith. The thing is, you've taken his answer and you've made that your madhab. It's not like you have access to the hadith, or it's not like you were there when the Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam did the act and you have a holistic understanding, or you don't. You're receiving that hadith with its interpretive application as well from the imam that you asked.
And actually, Mashallah, one question here: is there a one-to-one relationship between fiqhi position and hadith? Like, is it like every hadith produces one fiqhi opinion? One fiqhi opinion only maps to one hadith? Can a fiqhi opinion map to many hadith? Can it map to many ayat of Quran? Can it map to no hadith, no Quran?
I think the short answer to that is that sometimes it'll happen that one hadith can apply to 100 different fiqhi masail, or there's one fiqhi asl that's taken from 100 different hadith. So it works both ways.
What does asl mean?
Asl means like a one fiqhi rule, or you can say
Maxim or principle.
maxim or something of that nature.
And I think that's the guess. So sometimes one hadith is what we call is used for what we call qawaid al-fiqh, which is legal maxims. So legal maxims one legal maxim is derived, for example, from one hadith, and many different rulings then can essentially be traced back to that also. And actually, it's anyone who claims, anyone who claims that every action must be ascertained by a solid, clear dalil, that's never the case, and nobody can do that. So it isn't the case that every fiqhi mas'ala, every fiqhi ruling has a direct hadith correlated to it, right? Sometimes there will be a hadith, and sometimes it will be related to a qaida, a maxim, which has been derived from a hadith.
Or even other things, in usul al-fiqh, I think maybe you've studied it a little bit, Mus'ab, as well. And we've all studied it, I think. Well, not I think, I know. But in usul al-fiqh, you have the idea of something called iqtida'un nas, zahirun nas, isharatun nas, dalalatun nas. So these are all different. Sometimes a rule or a fiqh position, it's extracted from an indication within the text. Sometimes it's taken directly from the apparent meaning of the text. Sometimes it's taken from, a requirement of that text. Sometimes it's taken from different aspects of a text, right? And I think the more pertinent question than the one you asked, whether one hadith would map to one fiqh ruling or not, more pertinent question to that, and I think it's something I'd probably want to ask the muftis here as well, is that say, for example, we take the discussion that Mufti Tufail referred to earlier, and where you have the four madhahib saying one thing, and then you have a hadith saying something contrary to them. The question I think that arises there is that, are the madhahib qadin ala al-hadith, or is the hadith, does the madhahib, do they judge the hadith, or does the hadith judge the madhahib? Because a lot of times we would say that if Imam Abu Hanifa took a hadith and all the fuqaha that madhab took a hadith and mujtahidun, we would take that hadith as sound, even though maybe in the discussion of the muhaddithun there might be some weakness in it. But from the vantage point, the fact that the mujtahidun took that hadith, right, it would elevate that hadith to a level where a hukm can be taken from it. So I think that's a question that people don't think about. Does the fiqh sort of judge the hadith, or does the hadith judge the fiqh?
Yeah, like for example, like
That's an important question.
can you have a situation where you have a strong hadith mentioning one thing, and then the fiqh position is against that? Like for example, if somebody says, there's the hadith that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam ata subatata qaumin fabala wa tawadda qa'iman, right? So he urinated standing. And if somebody says, look, it's in a hadith, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam urinated standing, so it must mean that we're allowed to do it, right? It's in an authentic hadith. Why is it that we're not able to, just stand up and urinate?
So, mashallah, all of the questions are very loaded, mashallah. So it's a lot of unpacking to do over there. So, so one thing which is important, right? Why do we follow hadith? We follow hadith because it leads us to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? So we don't follow hadith, right? Because hadith. Hadith takes us to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That's why we follow hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But if, for example, if there was in Sahih Muslim, right now, if there was using the same chains of narrations, there were something taking us somewhere else, right? We wouldn't be following the hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is right. They're taking us to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam so we can understand what Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam did. So what is fiqh doing, right? So fiqh is essentially taking the hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and taking us to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So there's essentially no contradiction between the two, right? And interestingly, you mentioned that what happens when the four madhabs are on one side and there's a hadith which is seemingly contradicting the opinion of the madhabs.
Seemingly, because a lot of that usually doesn't happen.
I'm using the word seemingly, and I'm using that very strategically, because it may seem to be against what the madhabs are saying, but it actually isn't against what the madhabs are saying. So because there might be something that is beyond just that text. So Imam Tirmidhi rahmatullah alayhi, in his introduction of his book, he mentions that that all of the ahadith that I've mentioned are ma'mul bihi, means that they're acted upon one way or another by one of the fuqaha, and he excludes three of them. He excludes three examples, right? So I want to focus on one of them, which is the hadith of making jama, right, of joining salawat, right? So he brings a hadith which is authentic, and the authentic hadith is that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam joined salah in Medina without khawf, without marad, without sickness. And then he brings another hadith which is da'if, which is weak, and that hadith, right, contradicts the one which is sahih. And Imam Tirmidhi rahmatullah alayhi then comments and says, wal amalu ala hadha, and it says, but amal and what the ummah is acting upon is this one. So he's essentially, and another place, right? In another place, there's I don't remember the exact chapter, but it's in the Bab of Janaiz. It's in the Bab of Janaiz, and he mentioned he did something similar as well. And after bringing that difference, he says that wal fuqaha'u a'lamu bi ma'ani al-ahadith. He says that the fuqaha are the most knowledgeable when it comes to the meaning of a hadith. So when I say seemingly contradictory, it means that we don't what misconception people have is that when there's a hadith which contradicts some other, I'm not saying take that hadith and throw it in the garbage, na'udhu billah, right? What we're saying is that place the hadith, right, place the hadith in its right place. We are not denying that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam may have made jama, may have joined his salawat, without any other, but that's most probably abrogated. It's most probably abrogated. Same way, when the hadith which you brought about Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he urinated standing up, that establishes nafsul jawaz, and there is no faqih which will say that standing up and peeing in the darura and when the need is haram. We're going to say that it is makruh, We're going to say it's disliked, but we are not going to say that it is haram. And right, what we also have to understand is that in the corpus of a hadith, can we find, right, that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, for example, you regularly urinated? It's one isolated instance. So we take that one isolated instance and we say that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam did this action to give to show the ummah that it's not haram for an individual when there's a need to stand up, and the different explanations for that it was a place of it was a place of dirtiness, and Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam did not want to get dirty. So there's a bunch of explanations to there, but what we can immediately understand is that nafsul jawaz, that the intrinsic permissibility is established, but right, it doesn't make it haram, and it doesn't negate what the madahib are saying, that it is still disliked for one to do so.
I really love, Mufti Zain, how you used examples to demonstrate the principle. I think that's very helpful. As a matter of fact, we see, for example, the point that you mentioned about knowing the context of the hadith and like where it applies. So as you mentioned, nobody rejects hadith, but rather places it in its context. And I think this is something that beautifully Imam al-Tahawi rahimahullah does in
Sharh Ma'ani al-Athar.
Yeah, in Sharh Ma'ani al-Athar, he will say, like, he will list, these are the ahadith, and then a group of people follow this, and then these are also other ahadith, and another group of people follow this. However, like, let's see, what this hadith is actually trying to tell us, and then he will find another tariq, he will find another, chain for the narration, which goes into more detail and actually gives you, the context of the hadith. Like, for example, in the example that you mentioned about the Prophet ﷺ urinating while standing, he would give an example about the context, like, was his back hurting, or maybe the place was dirty, basically, giving that kind of context. And to like understand this principle, I think Ali ibn al-Madini, who was the teacher of Imam al-Bukhari, who was a unique teacher of Imam al-Bukhari, actually, that Bukhari would say that I never felt awe in the presence of any teacher except Ali ibn al-Madini. I've never seen anyone like him. And then Ali ibn al-Madini, when he heard about this, he said Bukhari actually has never seen anyone like himself, right? So they had that very kind of mutual respect. But Ali ibn al-Madini, he says something very beautiful about hadith that goes exactly to corroborate the point that you made, which is that a person cannot actually understand hadith until they've read the entire bab they're acquainted with all of the ahadith of the bab, right? So the reason for this is because you might find an isolated hadith where the narrator or even the author of the compilation, he only mentioned the portion of the hadith that was necessary to bring at that time. He might have not.
That was an exception. Like, he might have chanced upon an exceptional act of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam,
or not even necessarily like that. Like, we find, for example, Imam al-Bukhari, right? He has a tarjuma, right? He has a chapter heading, and he's trying to prove a certain point, and it's not necessary that he will bring the entirety of the hadith, where that specific saying is mentioned. Sometimes he'll just bring the wording that is required to prove his point. So, and we see the muhaddithun do this, and the only way, you also have to think about their perspective. How are they thinking, right? For example, if you read the works of Imam Anwar Shah al-Kashmiri, sometimes he will make a point. By the way, Hafiz Musab is also from Kashmir, so he'll appreciate this point. But when he writes, sometimes what he will say is, this is so because of the hadith that Imam Ahmad narrates from Abu Hurairah radiallahu anh, and he moves on. Like, he won't even tell you what hadith it is, but he expects you, you're reading my treatise, about hadith, so regarding this chapter which hadith Imam Ahmad related from Abu Hurairah radiallahu anh, right? So the muhaddithun, they're operating in a way that, okay, another person who will read this hadith will likely know, okay, there's a longer part of this hadith, and this is the part that I'm using. But this is why also, a person who's not acquainted with these nuances, it becomes now dangerous territory for them to, go into that field and be like, oh yeah, the hadith is right here, it's simple, let me just, extrapolate from it.
Cool. So one more question. Are there areas where the madhahib would never differ on?
I think no madhab differs on just 5 salats a day. Like, there are many ijma'i masail that all the madhahib agree upon, right?
There are a few books also, right, written Ibn al-Qattan al-Fasi and a few others that try to gather like masail that everyone agrees upon.
So even though so there are
Generally things that are ma'loom in deen bil darura, like the salat are 5 times a day, or that Ramadan is, you have to fast in the month of Ramadan. Things like that.
what makes those texts not hold other meanings, whereas other texts do? Like, is there a ranking in terms of like are texts ranked and classified in any way based on their ability to hold different opinions or
So,
options?
that has been documented, right, by ulama, and talk about, right, different, like wujuh of tarjih, and I remember one of my teachers was, he was explaining the concept of tawatur. Tawatur means successive chains of narrations, and Quran and Hadith, and then he the example he used was, like if you ever played Pokemon cards where you have XP, right? So different ways of how they've reached us, right? They have higher XP. So for example, the Quran, right, has the highest level of tawatur, which has, so that's like your 100 XP, and then you have a hadith of tawatur, which essentially tawatur, for those who may not be aware of that term, is not only successive chains of narrations, not excessive. So not only that, it's so excessive, and it's from so many different people that it's impossible that everyone is acting upon a lie, right? So like, a simple example, right? If there's if there's something that takes place on the street, and you ask, 10 random people that have no connection with each other, that don't know each other, that it's not possible for them to even communicate with each other, and they're all saying the same thing, you can, with a good amount of ease, you could safely conclude that this is what probably happened. So now you have, those ahadith which reach the level of tawatur as well, and then you have those ahadith which reach the level of mashhur, where you don't have those numbers, and so on and so on and so on. And then you have isolated ahadith. But now you have isolated ahadith, isolated, I mean khabr ahad, so one chain of narration, or one particular sahabi that narrates it. But sometimes what this one sahabi is narrating, right, it could just be that one person narrated it, but it's something which is taking place openly, right? So like, just because only one sahabi is narrating it, but that's the amal, that's the action of all the people for of that area, that hadith is essentially, gains that strength, and the flip side is strong, is also the case. So what's very famous from the school of Imam Malik rahmatullah alayhi is the amal of Ahlul Medina, right? So Imam Malik rahmatullah alayhi, right, sometimes he'll give preference to the amal of Ahlul Medina, and he's saying, he's not rejecting the hadith, but he's saying that there might be some discrepancy in how it's reached us, or there might be some discrepancy in in the fact that it's possible that it's something which is abrogated. So there's no simple answer to know which ahadith are.
What is Amal of Ahl Medina?
Amal of Ahl Medina is the action of the people of Medina, right? So what the people of Medina are acting upon.
Yeah, and
Why would that have any significance?
Their mentality is basically that because that's the city of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and the people inherited the actions of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam as he did them when he passed away better than anybody else. Anybody that was living elsewhere, if they all agree on something, then it's most likely what the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that was the last practice that he had. This is also a point that's similar, for example, for the Hanafiya, where if a narrator of a hadith contradicts his own narration, like for example, he narrates a hadith about the Prophet ﷺ doing X action, but then the Sahabi himself, he acts differently, right? His own fatwa or his own action is different. Then this shows that he's narrating the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ for the sake of preservation, but the last habit or the last practice of the Prophet ﷺ before he passed away, it was to act a certain way. So this is also so I think Mufti Zain, mashallah, may Allah reward him and bless him, and bless his memory for remembering all these very specific examples. They're actually very helpful, especially for any viewer who might not be acquainted with the abstract concept of it. But I think the point is that is meant to be driven in is the idea that there's so much nuance when it comes to hadith, and there are experts, and we're not even necessarily talking about just fuqaha, but we're talking about muhaddithun as well, that have the scholars of hadith, the ahlul hadith have gone into the depths of what other narrations are there, what which narrations have extra wording, which narrations have less wording, what was the timing of this hadith, which sahabi narrates this hadith, when did he accept Islam, versus the hadith that contradicts it, which narrator narrates that hadith, and when did he accept Islam. There's so much at play here that it's a very simplistic and maybe somewhat even insultful to the deen to say that, oh yeah, I came across this hadith and like therefore I'll act upon it. It's kind of just rejecting and throwing away the effort of the muhaddithun.
So I want to go to another point now. What is the significance of the saying al-ammi la madhhab lahu, that the ammi, he doesn't have a madhab? Are common people required to follow a madhab or a scholar? What are they liable for? Like when I say that, I mean, like, let's say there's the imam in their masjid who they perceive to be a scholar, and they ask him, is that enough for them? Or are they liable to go even further and make sure that he is, an alim of a madhab, of their madhab? What is the ruling on this matter?
And if I can add to that, are they required? Is that Ammi also required to go look for a mufti of his madhab? Or if there's a local scholar or a local imam, should they just stick to that person?
So I think from what I understand from that saying, al-ami la madhhab lahu is essentially referring to when an individual asks an alim a question, then the madhab of that person becomes the madhab of the person who is asking. So that's like a person, like your general average person who doesn't have any idea, right, what a madhab is or what it's not, or what, like a non-Muslim, new Muslim, right? So his madhab is essentially to take the madhab of the imam, right? And as you mentioned before, that's the responsibility of the amir, is to ask.
What if I say that, okay, let's not use the example of a new Muslim, because there's going to be many things that he doesn't know. Let's take the example of a Muslim who has the ideal basic education, right? The ideal basic education. Would this be part of his basic education to know that I follow such and such madhab? Or does he have no concept? Like, is it okay if he has no concept of madhab and he just goes to whoever he perceives to be an alim?
Right, so that's why we mentioned that asking a question is one thing, and talab al-ilm is another thing. So to actively involve oneself, and this is an obligation, even though it may be a forgotten obligation, it's nonetheless an obligation. That it's an obligation for every Muslim to learn what their deen has to teach them about every aspect of their lives. Right, there's 5 branches of deen. إيمانيات, عبادات, معاملات, معاشرات, and أخلاقيات, آداب and أخلاقيات. A Muslim is obligated to learn about all 5 of these branches, right? So what is he going to learn, right? He should select a madhab that's within his that he can find somebody to teach him from that madhab, so that he can learn his deen, right? And now when he has a question, right, he asks the imam, and then he's at the mercy of the imam giving them the answer that he requires.
So if you say that he has to select a madhab, that means he is mukallaf, or he is required to know what madhab he's following and seek out a scholar of that madhab. Is that right?
Well, like mukallaf is, again, so that's a strong word, because mukallaf is right, like I wouldn't say
In a literal sense.
Is directly mukallaf, right? But we'll say not indirectly, but like to make tanzim of their deen, is to essentially follow one way of one methodology of following deen, and that's where the madhaib come. Otherwise, how is he going to study fiqh if he's going to take from different avenues, right? He has to study one methodology so that he can practice on his deen.
But I'm not even asking about a person who wants to study fiqh or become a talib ilm. I'm talking about.
So that's what I'm saying is that it's not it's why we're restricting it to a person who wants to study. It's an obligation, right? Every Muslim has to learn their deen. So every Muslim has to learn the fard ayn. So so to learn the fard ayn, how are they going to learn the fard ayn? They have to learn from a teacher, and that's where we take a teacher, or we take a madhab that a teacher could teach us.
Well, I mean, like a lot of Muslims, maybe majority of Muslims, don't really like know which madhab they follow, or like which madhab they should follow, and they're maybe used to like just asking their local imam. So, would you say that at that point it's necessary for a person to, go back to their parents and see like, okay, what madhab were you following, and based by birth, now I will follow this, or would it be that the local scholar who they're following, whatever madhab he follows, that's the madhab that they start following?
And to add to that, given our context, you may have most masajid in America, you may have an imam who comes for 2 years, he goes, another imam comes for a year, right? Or you're living between two masajid, one imam is like, he's not even an alim, he's just an imam, but he's very pious, big turban, everything, and he speaks Arabic, so he's like, oh wow, this guy is, and the other guy, he's a desi.
Turban.
So the other guy, he doesn't speak Arabic that well, maybe, but he's trained, right? So his perception now comes in. Like if he asks the person, every time his imam is changing in his masjid, right? Even if they are ulama, or if the person, he perceives him to be an alim because he talks like it and he looks like it. So I guess in all these cases, is it okay?
I don't think there's
sorry, I didn't mean to. I think at a basic level, every Ami has a responsibility to choose a alim. You can say ala wajh al-basira, like he should do his homework on which alim he's going to listen to or which scholar he's going to listen to. He has to do that much. Then after that,
does there have to be any criteria of madhab in that or no?
So, like, if that scholar is a well-reputed personality, he's accepted in the community, he has credentials. Those are things that an Ami can easily check up. Right? Do the scholars consider him a scholar? Does he have paper? Does he have some sort of credentials? Those are things that the Ami he can check up, and he has to check. He should check up.
Yeah, I generally actually advise
like his imam. He can't just go to the imam without knowing anything about him and say that this is the man I'm going to follow, regardless of what anyone else tells me. Like, do you even know who that is?
Yeah, I mean, I generally advise the youth basically what to do. That they can look at these two things. One is the credentials of the person, and once you hear them, you'll know if the person is knowledgeable or not. You see that they got ijazah. Again, our deen, it comes from Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. There has to be a chain of transmission to him, right? So does he have ijazat? And the second thing to look at is his taqwa. Are you comfortable with his level of piety? Is he a person that can be trusted about the deen, and so on and so forth? These are kind of generally the two aspects that I would say to look at. Mufti Zain, do you have actually?
So I would so why selecting a madhab that a person can learn, right, and even guide, even have a kind of a direction, even in their questions is essentially what you mentioned, is that if a person puts all of their eggs in the basket of an imam that's only going to be there for 2 years and is going to go for someone for 2 years, right? There's that instability that comes about. Whereas if it's one madhab, then there's that stability. There's that kind of direction that a person can.
It's a timeless direction. It's timeless. Yeah. It's timeless. It doesn't matter who comes and goes and.
And how does a person choose? I think it all depends on availability, right? Like a lot of our muftiyan, they say that if a person lives in an area where there aren't any like a Pakistani, for example, moves to Morocco, right? It doesn't make sense for him to remain a Hanafi or learn Deen al-Hanafi madhab, because who is he going to learn from, right? How is he going to actually learn? So it's better for him to follow the Maliki madhab, right? And it's
does
not
this still apply in a kind of global village that we live in?
Yeah,
I would say yes, because at the end of the day, it's like, you don't want to, I mean, I've traveled to Morocco, and I'll tell you that, it's really awkward when there's that salam that takes place. And you go to tourist areas and okay, fine, like you're the only one saying 2 salams, but like
Is
overall,
that
over the
like
thing.
fiqh assimilation, like fiqh imperialism?
But again, like we're it's not haram or anything, but it's like it's more. I feel like it's the more a person can and it actually is like public perception is a thing in Deen. Right? It's not that we don't care what the public has to say to us. Right? We're actually doing we're doing something like it's mentioned about Allah knows how authentic this is, but that Imam Shafi'i rahmatullah alayhi, who went to Iraq, and he prayed in near Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullah alayhi's grave, and he and the Shafi'i, and he believed that basmala should be done loudly, and he didn't do basmala loudly. So again, out of respect of Imam Hanifa, so public perception is a thing. So
I
it's
want
like,
to like push back a little, if you don't mind, and like hear your thoughts on this. But if public perception is crucial, then in that case, what if a person, for example, moves into a town or a neighborhood, a locality where they have one big masjid in the neighborhood, let's say within like a 20 minutes or a half hour driving distance, and what the people follow there in terms of a fiqhi position is not something that they find it to be sound according to the scholars that they've relied upon for the rest of their lives, and it's not even within the realm of acceptable difference of opinion. Then would you say that because of public perception, this person should, I can give you an example, like if they reach a masjid where they live in a community where everyone's going to do Eid based on astronomical calculations, right? But this person, they're used to following what the majority of the fuqaha for basically the last 1300 1400 years have said, which is basically to go with moon sighting, whether global or local. What should this person do? Should they just conform with their community, or should they be like the odd one out doing Eid on the different day?
okay, so again, so just to trace back as well. So public perception within the confines of Sharia, right? So I was speaking about specifically an individual who's choosing what, like, how to learn his deen, and he's in the milieu of a person of a full Maliki. Whereas if he starts to learn a Hanafi madhab, which is already unnatural, which is going to find a scholar outside of his residence, then he's going to stand out, and there's a better alternative for that person to be a Maliki. But that doesn't mean, right, that, like, for example, if a person actually has already learned the Hanafi madhab, then it doesn't make sense for him to just go back to the Maliki madhab because of perception. And to answer your question, again, it goes back to the lines and the confines of Sharia. It is haram for an individual to act on something that they believe is not permissible. So just because the perception of the people is otherwise, it would be impermissible for that individual who believes actually that this is impermissible for him to move to that based on what the public is saying.
Then why would Imam Shafi'i do that at Imam Abu Hanifa's grave, if that narration is correct?
Because according to Imam Shafi'i rahmatullah, it doesn't void his salah, right? So there's flexibility. There's a flexibility within, and like one thing that I'll share. I had one imam, which I found very creative, was that one imam who was leaving a complete Shafi'i community, and within the Shafi'i madhab, right. That Surah Fatiha is fard. So what you will find in many Shafi'i masajid, that when the imam finishes Fatiha, he'll give a sufficient amount of time for the people behind him to read Surah Fatiha. But now, as a Hanafi, right, what's mentioned in our books of fiqh is that if a person just stays silent for the ada of a rukn, then that necessitates such the sahu. So now what does a person do? So this imam, right, what he did is he elongated his ameen silently, and elongated his basmala. So he said, Ameen, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. So now that, right, like, although, like, it didn't give them that much room, but there's a bit of flexibility that's over there.
Another thing also to keep in mind is that a lot of the ikhtilaf is actually ikhtilaf of awlawiyya, not of jawaz and hurma, right? So it's ikhtilaf of what is better to do. Like, for example, if you take the example of raf' al-yadayn, when you come back from ruku' and you're standing up, then to lift the hands or not to lift the hands, right? the famous Hamlet question, to be or not to be. Here we can apply the to lift the hands or not to lift the hands. In this case, basically, the ikhtilaf is not one of invalidation. There are very fringe minority opinions that have said if a person does raf'ul yadayn, this will invalidate their prayers because it's amal kathir. But the majority of the fuqaha will actually say this is just ikhtilaf of awlawiyya, what is better to do and what is not better to do. Same thing with saying ameen loudly or silently, right? This is not something that is an invalidator or nullifier of prayer. It's simply a matter of what is better to do, right? So I think that's also to be kept in mind, that Imam Shafi'i, when he went to Imam Abu Hanifa's grave, it's not necessarily that he, out of respect, basically, he did certain things that, according to his juristic opinion, might have been, khilaf al-awla, against that which is preferred, but he did it out of respect of Imam Abu Hanifa. But I wanted to ask you a question, Mufti Zain, related to the previous question, which is that some people will say that for the sake of unity, right? For the sake of unity, basically, people should follow what their local community is doing.
I actually want to. This is a question I had, and I want to frame it like in the way I had put it down. Like for masail that affect social cohesion specifically, right? Is it okay if the scholars make an effort to come together, even if some of them have to do khuruj from their madhab? Like, would you agree? Is that kind of?
I think like a good example of that, if we can give Mufti Zain a good example of that, is witr prayer, right? Like if a person, for example, they pray in a masjid or even in the haramain, right? And they're Hanafi, so they can't break up the prayer into two and one. And the imam is doing two and then doing salam and then doing one. Then should this person pray behind the imam, or should they go pray on their own? What should be basically the norm that a person should follow? And I think you can think of many other examples where the imam is doing something, they're following a certain opinion, and the follower is not following that opinion. For example, if a Hanafi is leading prayer and he had touched, let's say his wife before coming for prayer, he shook her hand or hugged her or something, and according to the Shafi'i, this would be an invalidator of wudu. Then can the Shafi'i pray behind this Hanafi imam?
So I think like unity doesn't equal uniformity. That's very important, and sticking to one's principles and being respectful and not creating drama, right, is not something which is difficult, right? And if we look at the Hanafi madhab, for example, when it comes to praying salah behind a person of a different madhab, overall, right, even though there are possibilities of a person doing things which would potentially invalidate a Hanafi salah, such as, for example, if a Shafi'i had bled or he had vomited, etc., which would validate the Hanafi's wudu, even though there's that possibility, until there isn't that yaqeen that's actually happened, the Hanafi is permissible for a person to pray behind that Shafi'i, and there's no reason for him not to pray behind that.
What if there's a yaqeen?
Yeah.
If there's yaqeen, then there's yaqeen that the person doesn't have wudu. So then it comes back to an individual, praying behind somebody who he believes, according to his juristic opinion, doesn't have wudu. So he wouldn't pray behind that person, not because he believes salah is invalid, but because of that opinion. But again, that doesn't have to happen in a way which is filled with drama, right? A person can silently make an excuse, and he can like, if he was the hypothetical situation that he actually saw the person bleed, gushing out, and he's still praying. So I mean, there's ways of doing it that will still keep the unity of the community.
So in the situation where
if I may just add one thing also, that's why all the books of fiqh always say that it's mustahab to do what is like kharij an al-ikhtilaf. It will take you out from the ikhtilaf, just so that we don't run into these sort of scenarios. So even if a Shafi bled, it's still better for him, even in their own madhab, to actually do wudu, just so that they're away from the ikhtilaf. So if there's Hanafis praying behind them, and these are things that an imam should keep, be cognizant of.
is there ikhtilaf within the Hanafi madhab, within Hanafi ulama, of praying salah behind, like a mukhalif in madhab, someone who's of a different madhab, is there ikhtilaf like whose salah counts, or sorry, like whose madhab is mu'tabar, like is considered? So for example, is there any Hanafi ulama who have said, for example, no, as long as the imam's salah is valid in his madhab, it's okay for you as a Hanafi muqtadi?
So I'll take you back to a discussion I had on over the weekend. Is somebody asked, and I was traveling with certain people, and then one of them was an alim, and then we were traveling, and that one of the Hanafi ulama, he decided to do something which was khilaf of the madhab. So then somebody asked me and said, is there flexibility within the Hanafi madhab to do what he just did? So the answer I gave to the person, I said that, is there flexibility within the madhab itself? No. But is there flexibility from the angle of the action of certain Hanafi ulama, or how certain ulama opine regarding that matter? Yes, there's differences, right? So I think it's important to separate what contemporary Hanafi ulama come to a conclusion on, right? And many ulama will come to a different conclusion of how much we have to stick to what's exactly in the book and how much we can come out of it. But when we look at it strictly from a Hanafi perspective and what's mentioned in the Hanafi books, then what I mentioned, that if someone who's following a different madhab does something which invalidates the prayer of a Hanafi, then that imamat would not be valid for that Hanafi.
So that would, so for example, in like Raf al-Yadayn, okay, you mentioned that there's awlawiyya. That's an ikhtilaf of awlawiyya, not an ikhtilaf of breaking something which voids the salah. But there was one masala, for example, from the ayat of sajda. There's one like Surah Hajj, the last page. There's ikhtilaf whether that's an ayat of sajda or not, right? So a Shafi'i would do sajda in that last page, but a Hanafi, because he does not consider that an ayat of sajda, for him that sajda would be sajda tilawa would be amali kathir, right? It would be like an extra, it would be like too much action, or it would be something that's not due. It's like you're randomly just going into sajda. So would this be something that also breaks the Hanafi salah?
I don't sufficiently recall enough details to comment on this one, so I won't answer this one.
Okay.
If any other of the co-hosts remember,
I won't say anything before any of them answer. So Mufti Tufel wants to give it a step.
No, I mean, I was relying on the on our guest Mufti Zain to.
Honestly, I don't remember this juz'iyah, so I don't want to comment and say anything without fully being sure about it.
Okay, that's fair. So I'll ask. There's one other question that I had in mind,
I remember related to this actually. Mufti Rada al-Haq from the Grand Mufti of Darul Uloom Zakaria in South Africa, mashallah, an absolute gem, absolute genius actually. Maybe one of the largest commentaries and the most beneficial commentaries of Al-Aqidah al-Tahawiyah that I've ever read is authored by him, and mashallah, absolute genius. One thing that he mentioned at a conference once is that generally I don't do Q&A. The reason for this is because questions are not meant to be answered on the spot. A person needs to do their reading, their research. To a lot of contemporary people, I think this ties in really well with the area of how to choose alim, how to choose a scholar. To a lot of contemporary people, every alim, every expert of any field actually should have the answer right away. But that's actually not how the majority of the fuqaha and the muhaddithun of the past operated. I remember there's one alim who actually compiled all the instances where Imam Ahmad said in so many different ways, I don't know, right? La adri, la a'lam, right? And so on and so forth. So many different ways that he...
Also famous about Imam Malik that he would rarely answer a question. It's very famous about Imam Malik as well. Sorry. Carry on.
Yeah, Musab, you had.
So going back to the question of like uniformity on masail that impact the society, right, at large. It's not like salah where it's like one person, one individual. Like for example, moon sighting, right? Something that impacts. Would you say that uniformity has a value and uniformity itself is maybe desired in certain things?
Look. What I like to say is that, right, everyone is going towards Allah Subhanahu wa Taala, right? And if I believe that this is not going to bring me to Allah Subhanahu wa Taala, why are you forcing me to follow this, right? So you as a masjid, you believe that based on your circumstances, Eid should be today because this calculation, this computer told you that the moon can be sighted, and this is sufficient for you. Go ahead, right? Don't force me now to follow your opinion, because I don't believe that Allah Subhanahu wa Taala will. I personally don't believe that Allah Subhanahu wa Taala will be happy for that. I believe that Allah Subhanahu wa Taala is obligating me to fast for another day. So if you believe otherwise, right, you have the respect to do so, but respectfully, excuse me from participating in your Eid today.
How about if
That
we
would be a
take
sort of a forced unity, and I don't think that's what's more ideal than a forced unity is tolerance, right?
how about if we take something like calculations is something that ulama generally they don't agree with, right? What about if we take something which is like within the realm of ijtihad, like let's say somebody follows global and somebody feels local, very strongly about local. What would you say? Like, let's say there's like these two opinions, and or maybe like there's something a bit more edgy where, okay, let's say somebody's following Saudi, right? They're doing global, but they follow Saudi. I don't know if that's edgy or not, but what would you say about that? Like, if like the city is following Saudi, should the other people, for the sake of uniformity, not unity necessarily, right? Because you've already said they're not equal. So should they kind of come down a little
So,
bit?
so now, so now, like the analogy is a bit off, because like calculations versus citing is not the same as local versus global. So there's actually a lot of flexibility for global moon sighting within the Hanafi madhab, right? So then that's a I think that's different. And then to add to the twist, the Saudi aspect, right? So the reason why there's a lot of difficulty in accepting a Saudi sighting is because that the shahada, which is, or that testimony, which is on which the ruling of the moon is being taken, is contrary to what's zahid, right? So what's zahid is that it's impossible to sight the moon, and the moon was sighted. So that's why even right in the books of fiqh, when we talk about the qadi accepting a sighting, there's all of these questions that they're going to ask, like, okay, what did you see? How many men saw it? And like, there's all these things, so that we can make sure that the shahada is actually true.
So what if somebody has a different explanation of the waqi'? Like they say no, their testimony, because right now we're arguing on the worth of the testimony. So somebody feels an alim, right? Like seriously feels that testimony actually holds weight, and it's like his analysis versus another alim's analysis, right? So he feels that, and the whole.
So I think over there, right, is that it goes back to saying that if one person is convinced, that's well and good for that individual, but that respect and actual flexibility in deen is accepting the fact that somebody is not convinced, right? And unfortunately, when we don't live in a society where we have a hakim or a qadi to actually, because the maqsad of the qadi is to make the rafa of khilaf, to remove any ikhtilaf which is amongst the people. So which if you look at the mafhum, if you look at the I don't know if there's a fancy word for mafhum mukhalif. Mufti Zain usually has those words. So what we can understand beyond that is that without a qadi and without a central authority, there is going to remain ikhtilaf. So now we have to respect one another and respect the fact that the one person is not convinced. And actually, interestingly enough, in the books of fiqh, there's a juz'iyah which is mentioned that if a person sees the moon, right, in the month of Ramadan, but the qadi rejects that ruling and says no, the month of Ramadan hasn't started, it is obligated on that person who saw the moon to fast. because in his haqq, because he saw the moon and Ramadan has started for him, he has to fast. But then that one sighting isn't going to be binding on the rest of the people. So what I'm taking from this, or what I'm trying to prove from this, is that every individual is going to understand his obligation to his creator in a different way. So if you've understood that this is your obligation to your creator and you're convinced, that's good. But respect and flexibility in deen, uh, it mandates that we respect other perspectives as well, that another person is not forced to abandon his position.
I think also another thing to add there is the aspect of ijtihad. Like somebody has an analysis, and they came up with an opinion. Someone else had an analysis, they came up with an opinion. Therefore, all ijtihad is valid. These are all dhanni matters, or these are all ijtihadi matters. I think this is a big fallacy. Not every single ijtihad is a valid ijtihad, right? There are certain parameters for ijtihad. Otherwise, the deen would become very interestingly
Fluid.
void. Actually, forget about fluid. It would be self-contradictory, right? Anybody wants to, deny hadith, or they want to adopt something that might be very, very extremely fringe in the deen. It's something that is possible for them to do, because they can just say that there's some kind of analysis, there's some kind of research for it, right? There are Quranists. There are people that will deny the entire corpus of hadith and say that we only follow the Quran, and therefore we will pray in a way that we feel is fitting to pray. We won't pray in the way that the general body of the Muslims pray, right? These are actual opinions out there based on actual analyses. But if somebody says these are all just ijtihadi issues because there's some opinion and therefore it's valid to follow, I think we'll end up in a very tricky place. You have people that will say, for example, watching pornography or masturbation is something that is permissible because it's some kind of darura or necessity for a person. You have very absurd, as a matter of fact, a person can even say things that fall under very societally unacceptable realms, right? If we really want to stretch this bit of the argument, we can go very far. A person can even say, like, you're in Darul Harb, so treat the women here as women of Darul Harb, and so on and so forth. Very unacceptable positions within society. But if somebody genuinely believes that there is an analysis, therefore it's ijtihadi and it's just valid to follow, then they have to respect all positions within that trend. They can't say, oh well, this is ijtihadi, so I'll accept this one, but the other far end, I won't accept that, right? Then it becomes inconsistent.
So I want to ask one, take it to a different place a little bit. So the problem with talfiq, right? Talfiq, like combining madahib, is that you might mix up the underlying principle, and then you're kind of doing two actions which are contradictory, but you don't really know it, right? That are in contradiction because of the underlying principle. But in the Hanafi madhab itself, there are different opinions, right? And not only are there different opinions on rulings, but there are also different opinions on usul between Imam Abu Hanifa and Sahibain. So is it possible to have talfiq within the madhab as well?
So talfiq again is when it's not necessarily a contradiction. It's essentially when a person ends up taking and picking and choosing opinions in such a way that he ends up following something which no one has said, right? So like he's taking bits of this, bits of that, and he ends up recreating something which no one is in agreement.
A situation in which both madahib, it would be wrong, right? Is that right?
Exactly, right. So that's talfiq. So that's actually very interesting that you mentioned that question. And actually, there's a big discussion on this. Actually, Said Bagdash is one of the people who've discussed this. So Abu Hajj discussed it. Maulana Ahmad Rida Khan has just discussed it. Is the Hanafi madhab just what Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullahi alayhi says, or is the madhab inclusive of Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullahi alayhi and his two students? And can we equate, talfiq? So can we equate khuruj al-madhab, which is taking an opinion outside the madhab? Can we take, for example, a Hanafi following a Shafi opinion and also compare it to a Hanafi which takes the opinion of Imam Abu Yusuf rahmatullah alayhi in a certain matter. My understanding, Allahu alam, right, and there's different understandings to this, is that the madhab is comprehensive of the qawl of Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullah alayhi and his two students as well. And when we apply, and I remember Mufti Tafil, we had this long discussion once in Ramadan about the tabaqat that and then Marjani, and his kalam and whatnot. But that there's work that has been done to hash out what is confidently the madhab of Abu Hanifa, and and I believe as a person that issues a fatwa based on what the fatwa of the madhab is. I believe that inshallah this is what Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullahi would have given fatwa on if he would have been alive today. Again, there's different perspectives and different muftis who have, again, this is a more usul ifta question, but that's kind of my perspective on that matter.
Yeah, I think it's also very important to mention. I remember, on the issue of whether you should follow only Imam Abu Hanifa or, Sahiba. And I think Sheikh Said Baktash, who's actually a great muhaqqiq, a great editor of many books of Hanafi fiqh, and he's also the son-in-law of Sheikh Muhammad Awama, who is maybe one of the biggest authorities in hadith living right now. He's written very convincing arguments, in favor of following just Imam Abu Hanifa and nobody else. He has a book called Takween al-Madhab al-Hanafi, and I remember, during my iftar days, I was very convinced by that argument. But I think over time, actually, you see that the strength in the madahib lies not only on the research of one person, but literally the hundreds of years that came afterwards, and it's kind of amalgamation of tahqiq and refining and processing of the madhab that occurs throughout. I think that's maybe one of the greatest.
I guess one question here is, what makes a school a school? Is it like what maybe a person would think would be that a school would have the exact same usul or principles, and then using those principles you could have maybe different conclusions in certain things. Is that what a school is? Or
but I think I know that,
and if there is, sorry to add to this, if there are differences in principles within the madhab, then why can't you just extend that same logic to the whole four madhab?
Yeah, so I think what you're referring to is basically differences in usul in terms of principles, right? Qadi Abu Zayd al-Dabusi actually has a book on the differences in usul between Imam Abu Hanifa and his two students, Abu Yusuf and Muhammad ibn Hassan al-Shaybani. However, those are differences in principles, let's say in certain maxims, or let's say certain usul, certain specific usul. But what you will find that's consistent for a madhab is their overall methodology, right? Like you will not find that a scholar of the Hanafi school rejected a Sahih hadith because of Amal Ahl al-Madinah, for example, right? Like there are certain overall paradigms, there are certain overall methodologies that the madhab will follow. And I think there is no contradiction if, in some minor usul, there are some differences between the ai of the madhab. Also, I think this also leads to, again, the point about refinement, right? That the madhab is actually the composition, and it's the amalgamation of the research of all these different ai. You will see that at times, the muftabihi will then have to change. The fatwa will have to change based on a person's current condition. Let's say they're in a certain condition in a certain country. You find some kind of leniency within the madhab to actually give fatwa on the opinion of one of the ai because of the condition that they're in.
So this is also something like you guys brought up a couple of times, the fatwa of the madhab or mufta bihi, right? So what is the fatwa of the madhab, and who decides it, right? Who decides the mufta bihi opinion? And is it possible that you can have two countries that follow the same school, but they have two concurrently different mufta bihi opinions?
I think what's officially more or less, I mean, that is a complex question, because you do have different fuqaha amongst the centuries who would say, okay, alayhi al-fatwa, and and wabihi yufta, and then you kind of have Ibn Abidin who comes few centuries later and kind of puts it all together and kind of based on different wujuhat says, okay, no, this is what the fatwa is on. And then, so to kind of circle back to your question as to what is the madhab, what is the fatwa, it's like with any type of field or any type of organization, right? That's best defined by those people that are living it, right? Those the masters of that field and those people who have kind of gone through it. Now, of course, it may seem as a very vague answer, especially because who is an expert, who makes an expert, and what makes an expert. But it's not that difficult, right? It's obviously like it's quite understood between any even beginner Hanafi student as to what are the mu'tabar, what are the texts which are relied upon, which fuqaha are relied upon, and which fatwas are relied upon. And now, if, for example, somebody else, in a different part of the world decides that this is what the fatwa should be on. But honestly, I don't think right now there's any discussion that ever takes place within our contemporary circles as to try to reevaluate the tarjih of the fuqaha. And if it's done in very, very specific circles. But more or less, it's more about application of different fatwa and if need be, moving away from those positions which are the muftabihi. But nonetheless, it all goes back to what is understood by the people of that school.
Yeah, I think also the muftabihi, the job of defining the muftabihi is reliant on the mufti. And you asked if concurrently, like, two countries can have, two different opinions or two different muftabihi opinions or rulings based on the muftis of their countries, even though they're both Hanafi. As a matter of fact, you can have two different people, forget about countries, forget about cities, you can have two different people that will have two different muftabihi opinions for them based on their condition, right? That's actually the art of fatwa, which is basically that you consider the entire kind of holistic situation for giving an answer. And I want to differentiate between what you'll find on like fatwa websites versus the fatwa that are answered to people in person. What's on fatwa websites is basically generic responses that can be found in the books of fiqh, and they're kind of cataloged there for the ease of people. But the actual process of a fatwa is very individualized. It's very kind of catered to.
But how about something which is like, for example, the length of the beard, right? In the Hanafi madhab, like, is it possible that the Syrian Hanafis could have one view, the Indian subcontinent Hanafis, the Turkish Hanafis, they could have different views on this? Because this is not something that's like, unless someone has a skin problem or something, like, what would it, could there be a difference on this?
So that's another issue that I haven't dived into, but theoretically, right, it could be a difference in understanding the text. So the texts are there, and there could be that someone could argue, for example, that these texts don't point to this and this text points to that, and they'll give fatwa on that, and the people who are following the ulama of that the found ulama of that particular country will do that. So like let me give you an example. Is that there recently was an alim who made, so we were talking about global and local. One very brilliant alim by the name of Mufti Abdul Malik, who's based in Bangladesh, and he's a student of Sheikh Abdul Fattah rahimahullah, right? He argued that all of the opinions or all of the texts which refer to global setting or what we would refer to in fiqh terminology as ittihad al-matali' cannot be traced back to Zahir al-riwayah. So he argues that it's not a valid opinion. Again, that's his research and his understanding. So interpretation of text and interpretation of what the fuqaha meant in a certain instance, that can be debated over time.
I think also another thing is the importance of combining the understanding of fiqh text with scriptural text, if we can say so. Quran and Hadith. Sometimes we'll find that certain jurists or certain muftis, by virtue of their training, they're so fixated and so kind of focused on just the fiqh or the text of the fiqh that they kind of sometimes maybe forget to look at or choose not to look at exactly what the hadith is saying and what the Quran is saying. And I think one of the things that actually can be respected, and many scholars have written on this, the fuqaha and the ulama of the Indian subcontinent over the last 2 centuries, and Sheikh Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda, who's a Syrian master of hadith. He taught in Riyadh for many years, and I think he was extremely brilliant. He actually dedicates an entire preface to, so basically you have the Sahih of Imam Muslim, and that Sahih has a sharh by the name of Fathul Mulhim, and that commentary, that sharh, has a muqaddimah, has a preface that's about 150 pages long, that goes into the sciences of hadith, the different issues in the sciences of fiqh. And Sheikh Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda, he takes that 150 pages and he expands on it with his own commentary, and that turns into 600 pages. And in the preface of that book, he actually dedicates an entire section just talking about the intellectual contributions of the ulama of the Indian subcontinent to hadith. And I think one thing that they had mastered, and I've had some decent exposure to their writings in hadith and in fiqh. One thing that they've mastered is actually the combination. I think Imam Anwar Shah al-Kashmiri, he was a very good example of this, where he combined his expertise in the understanding of fiqh, but also the text of hadith and the tafasir. He's very kind of masterfully acquainted with both. So I think there's a necessity, when you talk about the issue of the beard, I think there's a necessity to combine both of those skills and then to arrive at a fatwa.
So,
Just one point I wanted to add is, my Sheikh Mufti Ibrahim rahmatullah alayhi, he used to mention that fiqh has the flavor of Makkah, and Ahlul Makkah has a bit of rigidness. So when a person is really involved in fiqh, then they become very literal with certain texts and how they're applicable. And then you mentioned that hadith has the flavor of Ahlul Medina, which has softness. This is so for a person to actually come to a balance, a person needs to have that balance of fiqh and hadith as well. And that's why you'll see, like Mufti Tufel mentioned, that all the subcontinent ulama and how they really were able to balance their expertise in fiqh and their expertise in hadith to really give a proper understanding of issues.
well, inshallah. So, one last question, inshallah, and we'll wrap it up with that. To what degree should the common people who are following a madhab believe that it is the truth? Should they, like, you have many situations, like you also alluded to earlier, that a person will follow one opinion and he'll view a person who follows another madhab in a negative light. And for certain masail, like for example, I think folding hands and those things, like we've moved past that, like especially in America. But then you'll have some issues which are very, like, you can say they're like identity marks, like for example, having a full beard or this or that, right? So if somebody who's from the Indian subcontinent, for example, he sees somebody who's Shafi'i and he doesn't have like a full long beard, should he kind of have that okay, he should have the full beard, or should he just like kind of extend this all over, that wherever somebody's following their madhab and it's not wrong in their madhab, he shouldn't view them in like that they're doing something wrong at all?
I think as a Muslim, morally, right, you're expected to follow what's correct, and you're not expected to, and you're expected to have like shar sadr on what's correct. So a person, as a person follows a madhab, right, you should have shar sadr that what I'm following is the correct, and it's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is inshallah expecting from me. Now, as for having other people doing different actions around him, then it goes back to a few things. Number one, just because a person, if someone asks him, for example, that, oh, should I cut my beard, or should I grow a long beard? Because in the Shafi'i madhab, right, the person can cut their beard. I'm not saying that this is what their opinion. I'm just giving an example. So then a person should actually believe that no, growing a beard is is fard, and a person who doesn't have a beard, wajib, not fard, is wajib, and a person who doesn't have a beard, right? The implications of not following wajib are applicable upon him. But now, should he go on and should he look down and belittle a person, look down upon a person, or not engage in that with that person? That's of course not the case, right? There's a hadith of, and this is a longer longer discussion, but it's at the end. But in Sahih Bukhari, and actually Allama Shah Kashmir rahmatullah alayhi, he mentions this point. There's a hadith of Bukhari which talks about the Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is essentially predicting the war of Jamal and Siffin, which will take place between the Sahaba radhiyallahu anhum, and Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he says that تدعوهم إلى الجنة ويدعوكم إلى النار, that you're going to call them towards paradise and they're going to call you towards Jahannam. So now when the Shurrah of the hadith, they mentioned that this is referring to what was taking place between the Sahaba radhiyallahu anhum, and there was no one was calling each other towards the fire, right? But he gives a very beautiful explanation to this, and says that when a person follows an opinion, right, like for the person who was actually involved and taking the side of the haqq, for him, right, his opinion is taking him towards Jannah, and not following that opinion is actually taking him towards the hellfire. So not that the other person is calling towards the hellfire, but that when a person follows an opinion and believes it's fard, the implication of that is that he has to believe that not following this, for himself, that not following this is actually a sin for me, right? And this is outside of the fact that other people might be holding different opinions.
Inshallah, I think it's we've brought the discussion full circle. We started off with the quote of that my position is sawab yahtamilu al-khata, and the opposing position is khata yahtamilu al-sawab, and we've kind of come to that point as well. It's just why it's such a pertinent statement, that when you're dealing with people of other madhahib, I guess that's kind of the mindset you approach it with, that what I'm doing, as Mufti Zain mentioned, that you have to believe that what you're doing is right. Yeah, there's a possibility you could be wrong, and really that's for the mujtahid to do. For the common lay person, he would just have to hold on to the fact that this is right. So alhamdulillah, we're coming up on 2 hours. I don't know. Inshallah, I think that do you have any more questions, or do we want to ask more questions, or do you think that this would be
No, I was just about to wrap it up. Yeah.
So inshallah, jazakallah khair everyone for tuning into the podcast, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make it a means of benefit for all of those who listen. And I want to give a special thanks to Mufti Zain Beg for joining us for this discussion and sharing with us his experience and mashallah his immense knowledge. Jazakumullah khairan. If Mufti Sahib wants to say anything before we leave. And
Jazakallah khair for inviting me, and Mufti Tufel for the suggestion. Alhamdulillah. Inshallah, it's 2 hours, but
I also want to say, I'm really appreciative of Mufti Zain and the time that he gave us. Mashallah, he's an extremely busy person. He's very down to earth and doesn't show it, but mashallah, he's actually extremely busy. He's affiliated with many institutions, his own studies, and then his own institution that he runs, and then he's on boards for multiple different organizations as well. So he's doing many different things at the same time. May Allah put barakah in his time, allow the ummah to benefit from him. And as a matter of fact, we went through his bio and kind of just read it sardan, but there's actually so much to it, right? Like the AOF certification and so on and so forth. Mashallah, he's accumulated lots of years of studies and also experience on the ground, and he's benefited a lot of people. May Allah reward him.
I'll have Mufti Zain join us again whenever he can, and we hope that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala puts barakah in his time. We look forward to having him on our podcast in the future as well. and benefiting from his knowledge, inshallah. Mus'ab, if you want to add anything before we...
Inshallah, jazakumullah khairan. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Mufti Zain. And assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Well, actually, ask everybody, inshallah, to like, subscribe, and share the video as well.
Inshallah,
Assalamu
jazakumullah.
alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.